Welcome and thanks for joining today's presentation on connecting habitat through rights-of-way. My name is Brian Fainer and I'm with the National Park Service and help support the National Park Service's Connected Conservation effort. The Connected Conservation webinar series focuses on how NPS staff and partners can use various tools and strategies to conserve NPS resources at the landscape level. We host a webinar at least once a month, and you can find recordings of past webinars on our internal Connected Conservation Toolkit, which is accessible to all DOI staff, and also on the Network for Landscape Conservation website. The webinar series is open to the federal government and state government agencies, NGOs, and other partners. And you can find also links to the Connected Conservation Toolkit and the Network for Landscape Conservation website in the chat box there. We will post today's webinar, recording of today's webinar following the presentation. And throughout the presentation, please feel free to plug in questions into the questions box. We'll take a look at everyone's questions following the presentation. Our presenter today is Iris Caldwell, who serves as the Program Manager for Sustainable Landscapes at the Energy Resources Center, or ERC, at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Iris supports ERC's Biofuels and Sustainable Landscapes Research Cluster by engaging the agricultural, utility, and transportation sectors on special projects, such as pollinator habitat development. Over the past 4 years, she has facilitated the Rights-of-Way as Habitat Working Group to promote habitat restoration along transportation and utility corridors. In this role, she has led development of a nationwide voluntary conservation agreement for the monarch butterfly on energy and transportation lands. So in sum, she's doing really exciting work. And with that, Iris, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Brian, and thanks everyone for tuning in today. Really excited to share some of the work that we've been doing here at the University of Illinois, Chicago, but specifically through a network that we call the Rights-of-Way as Habitat Working Group. So you'll see this acronym, this ROWHWG, which is this working group that's engaging energy and transportation organizations specifically, but also a variety of partners, be it state and federal government agencies, nonprofits, academics, all working together to promote habitat opportunities. We've primarily been focused on pollinator habitat, but recognizing that there's a variety of habitat opportunities on energy and transportation lands. And specifically, much of my presentation today will be focused on looking for those opportunities for pollinator habitat and even more specifically monarch butterfly habitat, which is certainly on, I think, everyone's radar these days as we're watching these pretty significant declines in monarch populations, both in the eastern population as well as the western population, and recognizing that that's an indicator certainly for broader pollinator species and insects overall, as well as a number of other important wildlife species. So as we look and consider these habitat losses across the landscape, I think we're really looking to all sectors, variety of sectors, to really maximize the habitat opportunities that they have on the lands that they manage. And that includes engaging with maybe some non-traditional conservation partners out there, like energy companies, electric and gas utilities, railroads, departments of transportation, and others, which again will be the focus of my presentation today. So again, as we think about these energy and transportation organizations and the lands that they manage, just really quickly looking at a couple of high-level maps, we see these pretty extensive networks that crisscross the United States, be it highways, railroads, electric or gas transmission pipelines, not to mention distribution pipelines and systems, rest areas, generation sites, that are all across the U.S. And this infrastructure and the land surrounding the infrastructure intersect a variety of landscapes, from urban to suburban areas, agricultural lands, public lands. And in many ways, I think historically we've kind of considered these rights of way as habitat fragmenters. And yet, I think that what we're learning as we're working with energy and transportation organizations is that there's a lot of opportunity to provide beneficial habitat resources on these rights-of-way. And that these rights-of-way, instead of being fragmenters, can also be, or instead, can be very valuable connectors of habitat on the landscape. And so I just like to put out this vision of imagining what rights-of-way can alternatively be, as these important connectors. And even if we start with just thinking of a fraction of the roadsides or electric transmission lines that are out there, providing these really necessary, valuable habitat resources, really, I think, brings to mind the role that, again, each landscape type, each sector can contribute and really help us address these habitat losses and concerns that we're experiencing. So with that, kind of continuing that line of thought, as we think about how rights-of-way can be managed for habitat, we need to recognize that, throughout history, as long as we've had roads and railroads and electric lines and pipelines, there's been a need to manage the vegetation around that infrastructure to ensure the effective and safe and reliable operation of that infrastructure. And the vegetation management has certainly evolved over time. We've seen vegetation management from pretty extensive mechanical clearing and mowing cycles, the use of herbicides, and all of this kind of over time has been refined to what now is considered industry best practice called Integrated Vegetation Management, or IVM, which you'll oftentimes hear it referred to. And IVM, essentially, in just a nutshell, is utilizing a variety of tools for managing vegetation in a very thoughtful, sustainable way that really tries to minimize impacts, maximize the outcomes for vegetation management, and just more effectively and efficiently manage vegetation in a way that's compatible with the infrastructure that is within the right-of-way. And as IVM has really emerged as a more common practice, both within the utility sector as well as within the transportation sector, what we've also found is that managing for compatible vegetation along a roadside or in the utility corridor oftentimes means managing for plant communities that also provide secondary ecological benefits. And the ideal vegetation, say, under an electric utility line is essentially early successional habitat. And early successional habitat is a quickly diminishing habitat type across the landscape and provides support to a variety of wildlife species, including a lot of insect pollinators and the monarch butterfly. So just again, quickly summarizing the benefits of rights-of-way as we think about habitat. Some of these I've mentioned already, but we have this extensive network across the U.S. We have, again, these linear connectors, which can be really valuable for a migrating species like the monarch butterfly. They're intersecting these variety of landscapes, can and oftentimes do contain greater plant diversity than some of the surrounding lands, particularly as we think about really heavily urbanized or agricultural landscapes where there's minimal diversity out there. The rights-of-way themselves are generally free of major disturbances, especially if they're managed in a way through integrated vegetation management. They're often protected from future development since there's an operational need to maintain the right-of-way free and clear. And there's a number of research studies that are increasingly showing that managing rights-of-way through integrated vegetation management and similar practices really provides beneficial habitat. On top of that, if we're engaging utility companies and gas companies and departments of transportation and railroads to talk about managing their rights-of-way in this way, managing for habitat. We have to also keep in mind that they are also managing a variety of other types of lands, like rest areas, like generation sites, corporate campuses. And so you're engaging a stakeholder that has pretty large land holdings that, again, can provide a significant impact when we're looking for habitat opportunities. With that, we also have to consider some of the very real concerns that energy companies and departments of transportation and railroads have as they think about their vegetation management. And a question that we have oftentimes received is, well, what if our really good habitat that we're creating out there attracts the species that need it the most, like the monarch butterfly potentially? And there's a recognition, certainly within the industry, that from a business operations perspective, endangered species and their habitat can really complicate operations, add time delays, add costs, add additional kind of operational hurdles that, again, would cause, any reasonable organization to stop and consider, why would we create habitat in these places where there's a chance that we may have additional regulations or restrictions in the future. So the challenge that we have as we've been engaging energy companies and transportation agencies is to find ways to conserve monarchs or other pollinators while at the same time maintaining an operational flexibility for the needed infrastructure. We all agree it's important, to protect and create habitat for the monarchs. But the operational purpose of a utility company, say, is to deliver safe, reliable electricity. And so creating habitat can't come at the cost of detrimentally impacting that utility's ability to provide safe, reliable electricity. So that balance is really what we've strived to find. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Rights of Way as Habitat Working Group is this diverse network of organizations that have come together to work collaboratively to promote pollinator habitat and healthy ecosystems overall along rights of way and other energy and transportation lands. We're really focused on highlighting and promoting available expertise that's been demonstrated in industry, that's cost effective, and really builds on tools and resources that have been demonstrated and proven across the industry. The working group itself, we have more than 200 organizations across the energy and transportation sectors that have been involved in the working group over the past 4 years. These organizations come from across the US and Canada. And this diagram, I think, is really attempting to demonstrate or illustrate the really unique network, cross-sector, so cross energy and transportation sectors, as well as then building both private and public, nonprofit, and academic stakeholders together. And we've had a really unique environment to have really productive, open conversations around managing habitat. I'm going to highlight a number of our tools and efforts and projects that we've been working on over the past several years. The focus will be on the work that we've done most recently in creating this national conservation agreement for the monarch butterfly. But in doing so, I want to kind of lead into that discussion by, again, highlighting some of these other tools and resources and projects that we have. And I'm going to do that kind of by highlighting a variety of resources that we have on our website. So this really serves as kind of the command center for the working group in terms of the work we're doing and the resources that we're promoting out there with utilities and DOTs. So here's the web address at the bottom in blue. And across the top, you see that we have a drop down for resources. So we have a library essentially of best management practices, case studies. We have an interactive seed map to help utilities and DOTs find access to native seed sources in their area. A variety of tools, of which I will highlight one here on the next slide, and then other resources and webinars that we put on for the working group. Specifically, one of the tools that I wanted to highlight was an effort that we completed this summer to create a universal pollinator habitat scorecard for rights-of-way. So we wanted to create a common language to talk about habitat, specifically pollinator habitat, on energy and transportation rights-of-way that would establish a consistent kind of valuation method across these sectors. It was also important that we provided a very flexible tool. So we have a pollinator assessment that comes in 3 forms. So we have 3 tiers of assessment that can be selected based on the amount of time and expertise that you have available, the type of information that you're trying to collect, and what you want to do with that information. And so we really tried to, again, create a very flexible tool to meet utilities and DOTs where they're at in terms of collecting information about pollinator habitat. And then on top of that, there is an accompanying management module which helps utilities and DOTs understand the effects of maybe some of the management methods they're using and how those practices can both create threats to habitat, but also create opportunities as well. And so the corresponding management module is intended to be used alongside these field pollinator habitat assessments. And again, that pollinator scorecard is available under the resources and under tools within the resources library. We also have an ongoing project to create a geospatial habitat database. The intent of this database is to create a central clearinghouse where right-of-way industries, so both utilities and DOTs and railroads, can report in where they're managing habitat on within their systems. And this allows us both to track key habitat metrics across the working group, communicate with industry peers and across sectors, as well as with the public, about the value that rights-of-way and other energy and transportation lands provide for habitat, provides a way to engage with partners and communicate again about where there may be habitat opportunities or current habitat that's being managed, and then also can serve as a decision support tool for planning and prioritizing habitat projects. The database is still in its fairly early stages. We have about 10 utilities and DOTs that have been working with us to build out the schema and really refine the metrics that are being collected as part of the database. And we're rolling this out to the larger working group over the next couple of months. So if you go to our website today, we have basically a placeholder for the geospatial database, but over the next 3 to 6 months, we'll have an interactive web interface. So come back soon to find more information there. We also have this working group access component of the website. So you can create a free user account, and by doing so, then you get access to our working group directory, which is essentially our phone book within the working group. We have access to meeting proceedings from our workshops that we typically have twice a year. We have information that our task forces are working on in terms of various tools or other products that they're promoting or producing. And then we also have a interactive online discussion board, which serves as a platform for peers across, again, energy and transportation sectors, as well as other partner organizations to support each other, answer questions, provide advice, that sort of thing. And then lastly, as I said before, I really want to highlight, and I'll spend most of the rest of my presentation talking about this nationwide conservation agreement for the monarch butterfly. This is a voluntary pre-listing agreement known as a candidate conservation agreement with assurances. This is a project that we've been working on for the last 2 years, and it really is intended to hit at the heart of that question that I posed at the beginning of the presentation. How can we balance both the need for conservation for a species like the monarch butterfly and the business need that organizations like DOTs and utility companies have for regulatory certainty as well as operational flexibility in the face of a potential monarch species listing under the Endangered Species Act. So I'll dive into a little bit more detail about how the CCAA works and what it means potentially for you all, as I'm sure you have occasion to work with utilities or DOTs in your area. So just again, in brief, the way that a CCAA or Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances works is it creates a regulatory incentive for a non-federal landowner to create or perform voluntary conservation for an at-risk species ahead of that species being listed in the Endangered Species Act. In turn, those entities that have agreed and conducted their voluntary conservation get regulatory assurances from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that no additional requirements or restrictions will be placed upon them for the activities that are covered in this agreement in the event that the species becomes listed. So it basically eliminates that risk or that perceived risk that many DOTs and utilities have when they think about creating habitat for a species like the monarch butterfly. In kind of overview, this CCAA for the monarch butterfly is the first nationwide CCAA. So it's pretty innovative and precedent-setting in that sense. So it's certainly the largest. It was initially developed through the collaboration of more than 40 industry partners from across the U.S., both state departments of transportation, electric and gas utilities, solar developers, other industry associations that support the energy and transportation sectors, and really builds upon this concept of valuing that cross-sector collaboration that the working group promotes, as well as the opportunity to really utilize these rights-of-way and other energy and transportation lands for a conservation benefit. On top of all that, this CCAA has been developed in one of the fastest timelines of any such agreement, certainly of this scale, and has been just a really exciting project to be working on over the last several years as we've been working towards the potential listing decision that the Fish and Wildlife Service will be making. Originally, the service had intended to make the monarch butterfly listing decision in June of this year, which again really prompted us to work on a very aggressive timeline to develop the agreement. And then earlier this year, they pushed that decision back to December of next year. And I'll talk a little bit more about the timeline in a couple of slides. So again, the benefit of the CCAA is that it provides an immediate and a long-term benefit to the monarch butterfly by incentivizing utilities and DOTs and railroads to do that conservation at a pretty large scale, today. Not to delay, but to do it today. It then demonstrates that there is a significant conservation commitment by the energy and transportation sectors, and that can help inform the listing decision that the Fish and Wildlife Service is making. It also provides that really important regulatory certainty, so the utilities and DOTs understand exactly what they are doing from a conservation standpoint, what restrictions they have. It's spelled out in the agreement, and that no additional requirements would be placed upon them in the event of a listing. And in doing so provides them the operational flexibility to implement those conservation measures where it's most effective for them to do so. Also provides significant partnership value since we've been able to develop this agreement in collaboration, and has really generated a lot of public interest and recognition. Here's a snapshot screen showing the various organizations, again, both utilities and energy companies, as well as state departments of transportation and other key partners. I'll just give you a moment to soak these in. These partners represent operations all across the lower 48 states. We've had really broad participation and interest across the entire Monarch migration geography. Okay, so the next couple of slides, I'm going to give just a couple of additional details on how the CCAA will function. I would imagine that this may be especially of interest to you, particularly if you work directly with utilities or DOTs in any of your work. So essentially, in enrolling in the CCAA, a utility or DOT commits to enroll either all or a portion of their lands, so their operational system, into the agreement. And this can include lands that they own, that are leased or an easement, but where they are doing vegetation management. So they select, again, the entire system or a portion of their system to enroll. On a subset of those lands, they then commit to doing conservation measures, which I'll describe in a little bit more detail here shortly. And the lands where they are doing conservation measures, we call adopted acres. So they're the lands where they are adopting the conservation measures. And that can range anywhere from 1% of their system in the case of a distribution network for electric or gas. For interstate highways, it's 8% of their system is the minimum adopted acres target. And then for electric or gas transmission systems, it's up to, or at least 18% of their system must have these adopted conservation measures performed on them. They're also committing then to tracking where they're conducting these conservation measures and periodically monitoring and reporting on the effectiveness of those conservation measures in terms of creating habitat. The conservation measures, just to quickly give you a summary of what those entail, can be one or all of these items. They can be implemented, again, on a portion of the adopted acres or the entire system of adopted acres. So it really provides flexibility for the utilities and the DOTs to select the conservation measures that are most appropriate for certain parts of their system. So it can consist of planting or seeding milkweed or other native flowering plants to create very beneficial nectar resources or host plants. Can include adjusting the timing for mowing or brush removal or pesticide use to minimize impacts to monarchs, their eggs, caterpillars. It can include reducing mowing overall, so adjusting the timing as well as reducing mowing and spraying, specifically promoting targeted herbicide use where appropriate to enhance suitable habitat, reduce the impacts of invasive or noxious species, and really, again, promote the beneficial plants that will support monarchs and other pollinators. Increasingly, we're seeing utilities and DOTs adopting other vegetation management practices, such as grazing, prescribed burning, or other techniques that can be used to really, again, promote beneficial plants. And then lastly, another set of conservation measures would include simply setting aside lands into more of a natural cover state. So minimizing vegetation management altogether. We envision these types of set-asides being, maybe on corporate campuses, generation sites, rest areas, maybe where appropriate portions of rights-of-way as well, where there would be just simply very minimal active management and really allow the natural vegetation to flourish. So in turn for doing those conservation measures, there's a variety of assurances that, again, are provided. And this is, again, where the regulatory certainty comes. So the Fish and Wildlife Service, through this CCAA agreement and the permit that it provides or issues, ensures that there's no additional conservation measures that would be required, and doesn't impose any additional restrictions beyond those that have been voluntarily agreed to as part of the conservation measures or these covered activities. And so as it's defined, again, if we think back to that, the upside down triangle, these covered activities then are authorized to be performed in all the other areas of the enrolled lands separate from the adopted acres. So enrolled lands minus adopted acres, what's remaining, these additional covered activities can be performed. So general operations in terms of managing the vegetation, conducting surveys or inspections, maintenance on the infrastructure, minor structural maintenance, potentially minor construction in the existing right-of-way. So not new construction, but any existing infrastructure, minor construction that may occur within that footprint, as well as emergency response activities. These are detailed out in a little bit more detail within the CCAA agreement, but just for the purposes of today's presentation, I kept these at a pretty high level. So in terms of what's next, we are anticipating that the Fish and Wildlife Service will finalize the CCAA by the end of this year. We had a 60-day public comment period where the CCAA was published in the Federal Register back in April through June. And the service has been in the process of addressing those public comments and working with our team to make additional modifications to the CCAA to address those comments. And that process is coming quickly to a close. And so we anticipate that the agreement will be finalized again before the end of the year. From that point on, we will be working with utilities and DOTs and railroads to conduct their applications and enroll in the agreement. We have a number of incentives in place to encourage these partners to enroll in the CCAA before May of next year, at which point those commitments can be considered by the Fish and Wildlife Service in their listing determination. And at this point, we have about 50 interested utilities and state departments of transportation that either are currently working on their applications, have indicated their intent to apply, or otherwise are in the process of evaluating their participation in the agreement. And then from that point on, we'll be working very closely with these partners as they are implementing conservation measures, tracking and monitoring those, and enrollment in the agreement will be allowed up until a potential effective listing date if in fact the service decides to list the monarch butterfly. After that date, there would no longer be an opportunity to enroll in the CCAA, again, because it's a pre-listing agreement. So what can you all do? A couple of things. Here we have, again, a link to our website. We have a number of webinar recordings. We have case studies. talking points about the CCAA and other approaches or strategies that utilities and DOTs can take when thinking about managing habitat, as well as technical best management practices and other tools and resources like I have shared today. I didn't have time to include this video, but this second bullet here is a video that was recently produced by the Utility Arborist Association called Lifelines. And I think it does a really nice job of highlighting in a really visual, beautiful way the role, again, that in this case, utility rights-of-way can provide for wildlife. And specifically, one of the cases that's featured in this video is AltaLink and how they are managing for habitat throughout Banff National Park in Canada. So I thought that might be of particular interest to many of you. I'd also encourage you to start a conservation conversation about managing habitat with your local utility or State Department of Transportation or any other energy or transportation sector organization that, again, may have the opportunity to participate in the CCAA or otherwise promote habitat through their vegetation management programs. And of course, we're always looking for engagement from other partners across, again, government agencies, nonprofits, and otherwise in the working group. Increasingly, we have requests from our utility and DOT partners to find ways that they can better engage with government agencies, find collaborative approaches to be able to do their work more efficiently and effectively, and really proactively supporting habitat. So if you're interested, I'm happy to add you to our contact list for the working groups. You'll get future updates about webinars or meetings that we're having, as well as other tools or products that we're developing through the working group. So again, there's definitely a role for you all to play within the Rights of Way as Habitat working group as well. So with that, wanted to provide, here's my contact information, here's my face. You can put a face to the voice you've been listening to so far, and again, our website link for more information. So with that, Brian, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thanks Iris for an excellent presentation. Okay, folks, again, if you have any questions for Iris, feel free to type them into the questions tab, and then I can see them and ask them to Iris. So we've got a couple already here. There's a comment here. I noticed that there's no seed vendors specialists listed for the West. I work for the NPS as a revegetation specialist and have lists that I could provide if you are interested. And that came from Katie Vincent with Park Service. Yes, please, Katie. This seed map that we have, we actually just kicked that off this summer. It was an intern project that we had. And we are very aware that we do not have a complete list of seed vendors. So would be very welcome to receive any resources or contacts or leads that you might have. So thank you. Excellent. All right, here's another one. What happens to the CCAAs if the Monarch is not listed? That's a great question. And as you can probably imagine, it's a question that we get often from our utilities and DOTs as well. I mean, they certainly see the value in, again, enrolling early, helping to inform the listing decision. But what happens if, a year from now, in December 2020, if the service chooses not to list or recommend for listing the Monarch? Does that, in essence, kind of undermine or take the floor out from underneath the CCAA? And a couple of responses that we like to kind of highlight when thinking about that. One is certainly with a species like the monarch butterfly that is,
has captured the attention of so many. I think we're all certainly expecting that whatever decision that the service makes, there will be litigation and dispute. And certainly we've seen with other species of kind of this this level of interest and attention that it can result in the species being kind of toggling on and off the endangered species list. And so we fully anticipate that that's a possible reality for the monarch butterfly. And so throughout all of that potential kind of flipping back and forth in terms of its regulatory status, there's, I think, a strong case to be made that industry just wants some regulatory certainty that if they do X, Y, Z, they'll be able to continue to manage their rights of way as they need. And so I think having that kind of clear plan and approach still provides a lot of value through maybe some uncertain regulatory times. So I think that's a really strong case to be made for the CCAA remaining viable and providing value even if the listing decision initially is not to list. It also provides a really important avenue for, again, utilities and DOTs to very publicly commit to managing their rights of way and their other lands in a way that creates this benefit for monarchs and other species. Many of them are already doing practices that are creating habitat. They know full well that they have some excellent habitat out there. And this is a way to be able to, again, demonstrate that and make a public commitment to continuing to managing their lands this way. And it again provides an important, I think, level of commitment for the service to see that there are these organizations that take their role as land stewards very seriously and are willing to make commitments to manage their rights of way and other lands in a way that's beneficial to monarchs and other species. We've talked about potentially, once this monarch CCAA is finalized, really thinking more from a landscape level and conservation strategy, that we may consider amending the agreement in the future to include other species that have very similar habitat needs. So I think that's a possibility, which would also continue to add, again, kind of layer the value that this single agreement could provide to the participating organizations.
Great. And we have a couple of questions relating to what the CCAA says as it relates to federal land. And a related question, can NPS land, I guess this would depend on the deed, the right of way and all the rest, but can federal land, Park Service land possibly also be considered or become an adopted acre?
Yeah, so the way that it's currently structured, and again, we anticipate that it'll be finalized this way, although we've had ongoing discussions with the service on this, but the utility, I'll just use as a utility, although it could be a DOT potentially as well, but if a utility had an easement that went through Forest Service land or National Park land or BLM land that was an easement, they could, if within their, it was consistent with their easement agreement, conduct conservation measures and count those towards their adopted acres. However, given the limitations of the CCAA, they would not be able to receive assurances for those conservation measures on federal lands. So the assurances part of the CCAA only extends to non-federal lands. So for those of you who are familiar with CCAAs, there's a similar agreement known as a Candidate Conservation Agreement, or CCA, so only one A, that is that federal lands can or are eligible for. And so technically, this is a CCAA/CCA because it covers both federal and non-federal lands.
Awesome. Thank you for that clarity. Yeah, there's a number of questions related to that. Here's another one. This is somewhat related. It seems like a key part of the ultimate success of this effort is where these new management activities will take place to maximize positive impact and connectivity to surrounding natural areas. Can you talk about how the where will be decided for a partner's portfolio?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. So again, there has been a recognition that it's in a lot of these vegetation managers, be it a utility or a state Department of Transportation, within kind of their authority to select where they implement their conservation measures, and to do so based on the knowledge that they have of the threats, the opportunities, where again they select whichever conservation measure or tool they're using that seems most appropriate for the location. So all of that, those decisions essentially are left to the partner to decide, and can honestly change from year to year. So there's an intentional flexibility built in to allow a utility, again, I'll just use that as an example, to manage 18% of their transmission system in a conservation measure in 1 year, and then shift where some of those conservation measures are being implemented in a subsequent year. And so we are really trying to build that flexibility, again, demonstrating that a net conservation benefit is provided across the board. That was a fundamental requirement of the CCAA. But given that, we're able to provide that flexibility to allow the DOTs and utilities to conduct the conservation where it makes the most sense.
Great. And I'm going to sneak a question in here that also kind of ties into this. And that is, how involved are the state agencies, or even AFWA, that Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, in this habitat working group, and kind of tying in and trying to inform, the state DOTs and the energy utilities? So where are the state agencies, state game and fish agencies in all this?
Yeah, so we have had, I would say it really varies by state. We have had certainly interest and participation from state fish and wildlife agencies, some from the very beginning, others who kind of pop on and off the radar, I think depending on the topic or discussion. I would say across the board, I think we have an opportunity to have a lot more engagement from state fish and wildlife agencies, as well as some of the other federal partners, in addition to the Fish and Wildlife Service. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has been a pretty key partner in the working group from the very beginning. They're on our steering committee and really have been instrumental, and certainly the CCAA is one obvious example, but has been really instrumental in helping us shape some of the work that we're doing. But I think there's a recognition both by us that are helping to facilitate a lot of this work, but also in the requests that I get from individual participants in the working group, that I think there's a lot more we can do to more broadly engage and find forums for building strategies with other agencies, be it state or federal.
Great. And I'm going to sneak in another question here. Why aren't, you mentioned those different partners that are part of the CCAA. I was just wondering, why aren't there more? I mean, we were talking talking right before the webinar started about TVA. And so what about some of these other utilities and state DOTs? What is there? Are they finding it maybe hard to meet that? You mentioned 18% threshold for one of I forget if it was land
the transmission.
or is it just kind of, so is that a factor, or is it kind of still early because the CCAA is not finalized? What are the impediments, do you think, to for having more engagement from from roads and utilities on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say, the 45 or so organizations that I had on that slide represent the organizations that have been on our advisory team for the development of the agreement. And they were the organizations that essentially stepped forward back in late 2017 and said, this is important to us. We're going to dedicate time or money to help make this happen. And I think we were pretty, pretty enthusiastic about the level of interest and support that we had from those 45 organizations, particularly given their broad representation across the entire U.S., or at least, certainly the 48 states. As far as, well, why aren't there more? Because, right, there's certainly more than 45 DOTs and utilities across the country. I mean, what I can say is we have many more utilities and DOTs that are involved in the broader Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group. I think many of them have been kind of watching this process unfold, and for whatever reason, if it's a capacity issue or just trying to gauge the process and how it's going to work and how it might function for them, have been watching it more so from the sidelines. We're increasingly, as the agreement approaches its final stages, and hopefully will be finalized the end of this year, we're getting increasingly requests and inquiries, both from those organizations who have been kind of following the process, I think more so from the shadows, but also organizations that are just learning about the working group, are just learning about the CCAA, and are coming on board and really excited about it. So part of it is, I think, continuing to just get the word out, which is one of the reasons that, again, I encouraged those of you who have ongoing connections with local utilities or DOTs, maybe to help us get the word out. And if you think there are organizations that you're working with that would be interested in learning more, or potentially participating, we'd love to have you direct them to us.
Great. All right. Chris Stein, I'm going to try to unmute you real quick if you're still there. Chris, are you there?
Yes.
Chris. All right. Yeah. Sorry to surprise you like this, but you helped line up and recruit Iris. So, and you're doing so much in the Midwest region, working with heritage areas on pollinators. I thought if you had a few final remarks before we hand it back to Iris to close out.
Well, first off, Iris, I think you just presented an outstanding program. So thank you very much for doing this and for educating us. It's great stuff that you're doing with Rights of Ways Habitat. And I think all of us on the phone can learn a lot from this. I certainly, based on your education, have look at rights of way in a totally different way now than I used to. I'm even trying to explain it to bus drivers on my way into work. So I'm working with the large landscapes of national heritage areas, and there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of miles across national heritage areas. And so I am slowly trying to educate the executive directors from these areas that things like rights of ways habitat are important to try to implement within their areas. So I see all of these efforts dovetailing in so nicely. And again, I just wanted to thank you for providing this great program.
Of course, and thank you, Chris. I really appreciate the opportunity, to be able to present to you all and to, share this work that we're doing. And again, I think to really start to shift the conversation around, looking at rights of way and other energy and transportation lands kind of through that new lens, as really, again, I think the conservation landscape potentially of the future in many ways, be that, a good thing or a bad thing. I think, as we see just these tremendous habitat losses around the world, we need to really find habitat conservation opportunities where we can. And I think these energy and transportation lands do provide a lot of potential value that way. So again, thank you for the opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah, Iris, thank you again. Great presentation, and thank you, Chris, again, jumping in last minute there, but also for recruiting Iris. I mean, for folks that aren't aware, I mean, especially in the Midwest, there's a lot of great work in help that Iris is involved with, helping monarch butterflies. But I know a lot of other parks that I can see names on this list here. A lot of names that I know who are listening in are in some of these parkways and other long wild and scenic rivers or longer linear parks that or parks with a lot of roads that are definitely, there's a lot of interest in this. So the timing, Iris, again, for your presentation is perfect. And I hopefully, and I think I feel pretty confident that we can do more, and the Park Service will continue to try to do what it can to partner with everyone that's out there, really, where we can, where it makes sense and it is appropriate, to try to help our critters, help our park resources in all the different ways that we can. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you again. And I'm happy to share my presentation, especially since I have a couple of live links here. Again, one last plug for this Lifelines video. It's just a short 10-minute video, but I think would be of interest to you all.
Okay. I'll if you can send that link to me. I was having trouble pasting it into the chat box. I did put in the right of way, your homepage for the right of way working group. But maybe if you can send me the link to the Lifeline, I'll put that on our internal Park Service toolkit so people can access it. Sounds like it is on YouTube as well. So folks, look for that. And then also this recording will also, and we're kind of in the process of shifting things over to our Connected Conservation YouTube channel, believe it or not. Oh, thank you. Iris has put it in the chat box. So there's the link to the video that she was referencing. But then also, again, folks, we're in the process of shifting all of our recorded webinars to a Park Service Connected Conservation YouTube channel. So look for that in the future. I'm just giving folks a heads up. You can actually find it looking on the Park Service YouTube page, but that's where it is in the future. It'll be easier to find these recorded videos. So look for that in the future. All right. Well, thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of your month here. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks.